So welcome back to Reimagine, where we're here, talking about some of the most important, elements, narratives, developments that are taking place across the whole crypto space at the moment. We've called this conference, we've themed it our 9th iteration, a game of chains, because there is really so much going on, competition for supremacy. People, bring up ideas around, flippenings and the idea that, Bitcoin could lose its top spot in this sort of time when there's so much mania and hype and cycle, so much going on and so much noise going on of, not necessarily people talking clearly about what's happening and why it's happening. So in order to help clear things up, we want to bring in the experts. We want to bring in those that really understand the space, who've spent some time in this space and really, are a bit more immune, I would say, to some of that sort of hype and buzz that flows around. And I think our next guest definitely, exemplifies that to a great degree. So now, without further ado, I'll welcome Bruce Fenton. Bruce, thanks so much, firstly, for being here with us.
Hey, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Pleasure, likewise, to see you. And then, without further ado, let's crack in a little bit to some of these narratives. I'm so fascinated at the moment at some of the major narratives sort of going through the crypto space. At the time of recording, the big things people keep talking about. We're talking the news of El Salvador taking on Bitcoin as an official currency. Obviously, Musk endlessly tweeting one way or the other on his love or hate for the crypto world. These are some of the major narratives playing through, but what do you see as important? What's the noise? What's really worth talking about and focusing on?
I think El Salvador is important. I think that's one of the news cycle items that really is important long term, because it represents the really big picture vision about what is important, which is these questions like what is money and what makes better money and how should economics work in the world and what will the world look like in the future. And I think that there's a lot of signs over the last year that, starting with institutional interest and now nation state interest, that shows that this thing just might be for real. And that's very exciting because it's always been kind of a binary play. It'll either work or not work.
Yeah, and look, a binary play, it may be, but I sort of always wonder, obviously, any nation state is good news involvement for Bitcoin, for crypto as a whole. But a country like El Salvador, I don't know, I feel like this often sort of gets passed in hype conversations about this. El Salvador is known as, the most violent country per capita in the world that isn't an active war zone. It's not exactly known for its clean, anti-corruption attitudes or anything like that. I mean, is this really the stalwart that we want for crypto, or does it not matter? Is all publicity good publicity?
Well, I think it's overall good. Remember the president and his party is new. He was the first person in, I think, 30 years or something to go from not a major party. He wasn't, their equivalent of Republican or Democrat. He's basically like an independent, and he's very young and very progressive. And, I'm sure that he's flawed just like anyone else. But, the problems with violence and corruption and those kind of things, that comes from broken money. And that's not the fault of the people that are in power now. It's from people who were in power decades ago. And I think that leaders and citizens all over the world are waking up to the fact that the money's broken. It's broken here in the United States. And it's just more apparent in Latin American countries, places like Venezuela and El Salvador and other places where these problems are even more obvious. But it's the same kind of thing. Money's broken, and it's a system that favors the cronies and the connected, and Bitcoin is enabling people to move away from that and break away with something better.
So, given this is the first example of a nation state taking Bitcoin on and cryptocurrency on as a formal national currency, what would you see as a metric for success? What does success look like in this El Salvadorian experiment?
Well, ideally, they could get off of the very destructive cycle of IMF loans and the kind of global money games that the powerful countries prey on the poorer countries. So rich countries will go into poor countries and say, "Hey, we're giving you aid," and they steal the aid from the taxpayers. So they go to the taxpayers in America, for example. They steal money from us, and then they say that it's aid to other countries. But the aid isn't really something that goes to help the people. What it does, the aid is typically in the form of wind turbines and airports and these kind of things, which are constructed by companies like Bechtel and Halliburton and Lockheed and the same government contractors that have been, bleeding the taxpayer and involved with all kinds of bad things all over the world for years. So it's kind of a sort of a scam, and it's something that is enriched the few at the expense of the many, and it would be very, very healthy for any country who can to break away from that. So that would be the ultimate goal. If Bitcoin helped get off of because all of these things come with the petrodollar and the US dollar based system. When you get off of the dollar, then there's a lot of other good things that can happen. And overall, it's just better money. So I think that would be success, and just to see if it really works and see if people widely adapt it. But at the top level, if the country can get away from these other hooks that the global monetary system has in them, that would be great.
I mean, do you see this, I know you, from our past conversations, you're an advocate of, hyper-Bitcoinization, hyper-tokenization. I mean, do you see this as a watershed moment that's going to lead to a cascade of other countries coming on board with the Bitcoin movement? Are other countries going to be watching this warily? Is this more about business and enterprise than it's about governments? How do you sort of put this into the sort of the right chapter of history, I guess?
It's early yet. I guess it's the country equivalent of when those first couple retailers accepted Bitcoin. Tiger Direct and Overstock were a couple of the first. So I think Tiger Direct was the first, and that was just amazing news because $1 billion company was going to accept Bitcoin. And it just seems silly now. Everybody accepts Bitcoin, but it was big news at the time, and I think it'll probably be something like that. It's still many, many steps. It's kind of like, okay, now the country's accepting it. Well, then there'll be another and another and another, and hopefully we'll get to the point where a press release about a country accepting Bitcoin as legal tender is no big deal. Then the next step is, are they storing it on their balance sheet and hodling? It sounds like El Salvador is kind of close to that already, but that'll be interesting. And then do you see the big sovereign funds doing it? And that's the kind of change. It may take a while. I mean, the time from that first major company accepting Bitcoin till now is several years. So it could be quite a while before we really see widespread change with a majority of banks or central banks or governments that are adopting this, and not only adopting it but holding it and everything else.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I suppose governments and regulators at that level are not known for a rapid turnaround, even when they do happen to like an idea. I imagine these things are probably going to be, counted in the span of years or even potentially decades rather than weeks or months. But thinking about one side, that's one narrative that we've been running, quite a hyping narrative in the Bitcoin space. But let's turn to the FUD. There's always plenty of that. Elon Musk. I know you've got strong views on the man. What's your sort of current take on his latest announcements?
I wish he would do a little bit more depth. I think it's, coming from a life as a financial advisor, I think it's irresponsible to hype Dogecoin, for example, without having a really solid thesis. But there's nothing wrong with hyping a particular coin if you like it. But I think when you have a position of power like that, and that much influence, and you have that many people who are kind of jumping into something because you are, I think it would be much, much better to, have a little depth. As far as I know, he's never really gotten, into depth, with like an interview like this. I mean, where he's just actually talked out his thoughts on the stuff. And so for somebody so influential to have so little depth, or at least no evidence that there's anything beyond very little depth, I think that it's not ideal. So until he, as he says, this thing about 50% mining, he's not going to accept Bitcoin. I'm not going to accept Elon until he starts doing more substance and more interviews. Do like Michael Saylor does. Not everybody likes Michael Saylor or agrees with him. I happen to agree with him, but at least he goes out there and he says his opinion, and he's very, very clear in what that opinion is. And I think that would be great if Elon did that.
Oh, but Bruce, as he pointed out, his PayPal history proves that he has the credentials to talk about this, no matter what. Surely that must be good enough, no?
Not quite. I think that Bitcoin behaves harshly towards important people who come in who feel like they can, and he's already doing that. He talked about changing the code for Dogecoin, which there's not much pushback because nobody really cares. But I think he probably has the same attitude towards Bitcoin. Even just his suggestion yesterday to say that 50% of miners should be green energy. Well, that implies that 50% of miners have to report, and they have to go by Elon's definition of what something is. How is that going to be policed? Are they going to get kicked out? Would somebody want to kick them off the network if they don't? These things aren't well suited for leadership positions, and I don't want 50% of miners collaborating on anything, and I don't want Elon as the leader. And I think that people who are used to being important, and they're used to being leaders, and they're used to being CEOs. Certainly Elon is in that category. I think there's certain things that may be harder to overcome in Bitcoin for somebody like that. They've got to realize that it's not their show to change things around or lead or push it in a direction that they want. But that seems inevitable. There's always going to be powerful people who are trying to do that. So, but I wouldn't be impressed by former credentials, whether you were because it's going to just keep going up and up. If this thing works, we're going to have former presidents saying like, okay, now's the time. I'm gonna set it up, and I'm gonna have the real Bitcoin group, and we're gonna really, now that it's finally reached 10 trillion, now we can have, like, these 3 former presidents are gonna run the show. They'll try it. You believe me. We'll see that. We're going to see a lot of people try, but that's not the nature of Bitcoin.
Yeah, and I mean, I saw in a recent tweet you made, even talking about this exact idea. You individually do not matter to Bitcoin, and that idea that this is beyond the scope of ego. There's between the raw mathematics that underpins the network, the Bitcoin network, to the sort of decentralized nature of it all, that an individual should not matter. Yet it seems that so much of the market, whether we talk about individuals or institutions, seem willing to give, at least in a correlative sense. I guess we can't see what's really going on behind the scenes, but there's so much power to someone like Elon, who, the second he tweets, the whole market moves. Why do you think that still is? Is this a developmental stage, or do you think there really is some attempt to centralize power here?
There's a lot of people who crave power, there's people who crave power, but there's also people who crave leaders.
Right.
And people want to give up their power. They want to know, like, what's the magic coin? What should I be buying? What's the next Bitcoin? They crave this. They want to be led. They want direction. They ask obvious questions all the time. Anybody who's in the space, it's kind of a joke how they get the same common questions. People want to be led. They want to. Everybody in crypto, people come up and say, what's the hot next thing? They want an easy shortcut. And so somebody like Elon, or any charismatic figure with power is going to be, people are drawn to that person, and they want to have somebody lead them and show them what to do. And it's not just Bitcoin. It happens in politics. It happens in the world. People are afraid of their own responsibility. It's work to have responsibility. It's less work if you delegate that to someone else, but it doesn't always work out, because very rarely do they have your interests ahead of their own.
So then that leads nicely into that next idea. I mean, I look at the top coins in the space right now, and you look beyond Bitcoin. You've got those that have the sort of cult of personality affiliated with them, or at least some sort of sense of leadership associated with them. Whether we talk about Ethereum, Vitalik Buterin, BNB, we've got CZ, Cardano, we've got Charles Hoskinson, Doge, obviously Musk, the list goes on and on. There are all these coins out there that have not just necessarily organizations or foundations, but individuals who have this sort of strong affiliation. Now, obviously, compare that to Bitcoin, and this is not a new idea or anything, but, looking at the space as it is now, what impact do you think that has for them to have, a leader to rally around, but also, I guess, a marketing guru or a direction point to give them? Is there a strength in that Bitcoin lacks? Will that be an advantage even in the short term, or does Bitcoin have its superiority due to its, the mysterious and enigmatic nature of its founder?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's advantages and disadvantages. Having a leader, a benign leader, is great. They can get things done quicker. And the ultimate leader of any system would be to have somebody who's a perfectly flawless, benign kind of angel who just does the right thing all the time, and they're very wise. And you can aspire to that. There's some very good humans out there. There's some people that are very wise, and they're people who are good people, and they do care about, in this case, a network or whatever. But from a security standpoint, Bitcoin is built sort of adversarially to be very, very different from that. So it partly depends on what the project is and what the goal is. I mean, if you want to make a movie, there's an old joke that if it has one writer, it might be good. If it has two, it may be good. But if it has 3 or 4 or 5 writers, it's usually not a good movie. And there's certain things that are best done when you have a clear vision and kind of a CEO. A lot of us are used to working that way. So these coins that have a charismatic leader, it can serve to rally people, and you can even have that in open source. Bitcoin had it to some degree with Satoshi and even Gavin Andresen, and certainly much less so now. There isn't really anybody in Bitcoin who has that kind of role like some of the other names that you mentioned from some of the other coins. But it can be an advantage to them. But I think Bitcoin just has a different security model, and it depends on what your end goal is with the project.
Certainly, it does depend on the end goal, and as I guess everyone likes to say, Bitcoin was the only one coin created in the vacuum of a pre-crypto space. Everything else was created with the context that there was definitely money to be made, there was something to be grown, there was something to be built, and there were egos that needed to be managed, which I guess gives its unique flavor. But all right, I want to take this point to pivot now and think a little bit more about the wider crypto space, where it stands at the moment. And I feel like here we stand at this point. Some think that we're already back in the bear market, and we're going to have the hype has ended for the meantime. Others say this is the pause before the next big run up. But I don't want to fixate on price here because no one can know any particular movement day to day. But I want to talk about sort of ecosystem building. Everyone, I spoke to so many people, so many founders, so many innovators who said that the crypto winter still, from this point, they still feel like the crypto winter of 2018, 19, and early 2020 was the great time for building, the great time for developing. Here we are in this hype cycle. Bruce, what do you see in terms of ecosystem growth, scam growth, development? Are we growing as a community still, or are we being lost in this sort of scammy, overexcited hype that still pervades so much of the space?
Yeah, I think the growth continues through the bear markets and the bull markets. It's a different kind of growth. Like you said, there's probably a much more high quality growth in the bear markets. Bear markets are a quieter time. A lot of people who come to our event, the Satoshi Roundtable, they like the bear market. I've heard a few people say they like the bear market roundtables better. It's just more serious. Conferences, I think, are definitely better in a bear market, although people may not feel like going as much, but that's part of the reason. There's just sort of less hype right now. I've just noticed a big uptick in noise. It's just harder my calendar's harder, and I have more pitches and more just general more noise, and it's harder to kind of find the signal and focus on what I need to do during the dark depths of the bear market. And even 16 months ago or so, it was nobody was calling me. It was quiet. It was just we were able to put our heads down and build. And I think that's the case for a lot of startups in the space. Particularly if you're like really thick into crypto, whether it's Bitcoin or DeFi or whatever. I think that bear markets can be a good time to build, but there's still a lot of building going on in an exciting bull market. It's just harder to find the really good quality versus those who are just jumping on the opportunity or newbies or whatever.
Right. I mean, I see so much of what you're talking about there, that idea of, so much noise being out there, and a lot of that sort of that fresh blood coming into the space that are asking some of the basic questions, which on the one hand, we've spoken about this in the past, but education is such a critical part of the space. Obviously, it's going to be new to every new wave of people, and those same questions are going to get asked every time new people come on board. But all you have to do is look at any sort of major forum, on Reddit, you sort of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency or any other major forum in the space to see that people are sort of getting frustrated with these same basic questions getting asked, and it's sort of called to do your own research, not really being heeded. As you say, those are those people in the space looking for a leader. But I suppose I wonder, does this dilute the space, or is this the strength and responsibility of a growing and still nascent industry that it needs to continue to educate for a long time to come till we hit that tipping point?
Yeah, there's a lot of it's an interesting cycle because you'll have a lot of people that educate and then they become the next educators,
Mhm.
you know, in this. And part of the education process is not just learning on forums, it's actually hands-on. A lot of times you have to make the mistakes, you have to dabble in scam coins or whatever. Everybody's different. It depends what your background is. Sometimes it's a very painful lesson. It takes 2 or 3 times. Sometimes somebody can come in and spot a scam right away, but there is an overall learning process to figure out, you know, all of the different things that are important. You know, why is decentralization important? Are groups and committees and clubs a good idea? You know, should I buy these altcoins, and who's the powerful people? You know, all of these kind of questions and the learning experiences. And sometimes people have painful lessons where they lose a lot of money, and hopefully they don't lose so much that they get discouraged and leave, but they come back and learn. And then you have a new generation of experts that comes from that. And also the people, it's exhausting to do education, you know. The people who were educating early on, a few of them are still educating, like Andreas, but Andreas is different now too. You know, he's very, very busy, and he's certainly not the way he can't be the way that he was many years ago because he's just busier. So but a lot of people don't even stick with it. They'll do it for a couple of years and then they'll kind of go into something else, and maybe something more profitable or whatever, or they'll go back. I've met a couple people in Miami who have done really, really well with Bitcoin, so now they want to go back, and now they're just getting into education. And sometimes people do it the opposite way. But the cool thing is that it's overall growing. You have new OGs. You know, anybody who's been around for a year and a half now is sort of an OG with these crazy markets. So you have people who've been through the turmoil, and the space goes on. And you have people like Nick Carter who you know, it seems like he just joined yesterday, but he's like an old timer now, and he's very, very, very high quality content. So you have this army of people from his generation, and now even behind. I mean, there's kind of 2 generations of people behind him that have learned. So you go on Clubhouse, and there's people who've been in the space only a couple of years, but they have just a great amount of wisdom because they've been in it so much. So I think that's exciting. And you know, you're trying to educate a billion people now, so
Right.
you need more leverage. You need more Nick Carters and Clubhouse managers and that kind of thing to really, you know, spread the word in a much. I mean, the people who have the reach that Andreas had, say 5 years ago, there's hundreds now. You know, that have what would have been a huge reach just a few years ago. So that's great.
Do you worry at all about, you know, a dilution in the quality of this information? You know, for every, you know, Nick Carter you might have who might be putting out good quality information, there are surely those who are, you know, putting out whether it be scammy or self-interested information. I mean, do you worry that they're also seeing an uptick and that misinformation is spreading, or do you think that's just a, you know, natural part of the cycle and people have to learn for themselves?
I think overall it's you definitely have more scams and more junk, but the volume of good information outweighs the bad. So if you have 10,000 new educators, you know, maybe 1,000 of them are scammers, but that's still 9,000 good ones. You know, the signal usually rises out. I mean, you look at an open forum like Clubhouse or something like that, where kind of anybody can talk. Usually quality rises or the rooms kind of die. You know, there's people who try and do scam rooms, but people just pop in and criticize it. It doesn't work well. They'll have to close it off. But usually the pretty good ideas that, you know, we're all human beings on this earth are on a search for truth. And it's hard to find what's true right now. We certainly can't rely on the sources that we've always relied on in decades and centuries past to tell us what's true. So we're all searching for what's true. And there's a lot of really high quality conversations, events, chats, forums. We've always been a great space for that kind of thing. Crypto Twitter, whatever. We have good conversations in this space, and I really believe that helps us find what's true. So the you know, I mean, you look at Bitcoin as a narrative. I mean, that's just emerged that a good chunk of people. I was just talking to somebody earlier today who used to be with a, you know, they were very well known with sort of another coin, but they've become kind of, you know, really pro Bitcoin now. And that's just kind of a narrative that's happened. There wasn't any central planning that did that. That's just something a lot of people came up on their own because that was their own search for truth. And there's other things that are sort of agreed on like that. So I'm optimistic about it for sure.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, plenty of cause for optimism. I would definitely agree there. I want touch, Bruce, I know you have always been an advocate of a sort of hyper-tokenized world, and that ultimately you have a belief that we should all be heading towards a total tokenization of pretty much everything in a market economy. But looking at the state of the DeFi space at the moment, in conjunction with that idea, it is a developing space, and I feel some of the hype has left it, as compared to what we saw, a little earlier in this year and the last year. There now seems to be some more solid work going on with people ensuring they're building, good liquidity pools, or their automated market makers are, really, bug-free and or issue-free, and doing good auditing and this sort of process. What are your thoughts about the DeFi space as it stands right now? Is it heading in the right direction? Are there problems still? Is it still a hype train? What do you feel?
Yeah, DeFi, I have such mixed feelings on it. I think it's a great idea, but I'm still not impressed by a lot of the projects and the tokens, a lot of the governance tokens. And, at the end of the day, you can make it really cool and slick to move an instrument around. But at the end of the day, you've got to look at, what is that instrument, and does it give you rights? And what are those rights? And, so far, for hundreds of years of human history, equity, plain old simple equity, boring equity, has been pretty good. Equity doesn't have to be boring. It's certainly not boring if you're a early investor in, Coinbase or Facebook or Microsoft or Google or Apple. Equity is very, very, very well proven. And so I would like to see more tokens that are based on equity, where you have, like you mentioned, things like real estate, which are typically, you have actual equity in this real estate or this startup or this major business. And because of particularly how the way securities laws work in the United States, equity is a security. And I think a lot of DeFi projects have made a mistake of, instead of saying, oh, equity is a security, let's figure out how to do this in compliance, they say something vague about, well, let's just kind of ignore that or forget that, or we'll make a better way. And you're not going to make a better way than equity. Equity is pretty good. If somebody has a better idea than equity, I'd really love to read the paper, because I'm a big fan of equity, and you'd be basically saying that you're doing a Bitcoin level innovation. If you're going to go out and say with a straight face, like, oh, I have something better than equity, wow, let's see the paper and you're going to want to have a parade or a press release, because that's a big deal. But they're not saying that. They're just saying, like, oh, I'm going to make it not equity by doing these other things so that I don't have to follow the rules as a security. I'll call it a utility or something like that. And I think that's a bad idea. And where there's a lot of confusion about it is people think that securities are the regulation. The regulation is just based on a definition. So if you have something good like equity or a bond or something else that makes sense, unfortunately, the law, governs that very heavily. So unless you're going to change the laws, there isn't really a way to, skirt around them, not unless you strip out anything useful from it and it's, not equity anymore. And that's unfortunately what most have done. I think that's misguided. And I've mentioned that, and they misunderstand. They think like, oh, you just want regulation or something. That's not the case. It's the regulations are with us. They've been with us for almost 90 years, and they're based on this definition. So as soon as something is like equity, it's under those regs. But the good news is, these things could be compatible. Even something with a decentralized base layer like Uniswap could be compatible with securities regulation if you build it on the, on the second layer. So I think that what is being built now will be good learning experiences for, what comes next, which will actually be able to work the way it's supposed to with equities and everything else.
Yeah. Bruce, are you back?
Yeah, I'm there. Hey there. Can you hear me?
Hey, Bruce. Sorry, we had a
Did you lose me?
The power here all of a sudden. Yeah. I think we've got it back. So let's keep going, and I'll ask another question. We'll make sure that our editors do a smooth cut there. But so would you say then that the issue stems from the sort of not you spoke about like the issue being that they're not relying on equity, and people are afraid of sort of using that idea. Do you think the issue is that innovators in the DeFi space are afraid of the legacy financial system? They're not aware of it properly. They might be fine coders, but they don't necessarily have the economics and commerce backgrounds to really understand it. What do you think the issue is there?
I think the main thing is just an understanding of, just as simple as it is, how the world works and what instruments make sense. Instruments like equity make a lot of sense, and their equity, whether we like it or not, is very, very heavily regulated. Equity is definitely a security, and that means all of the things that come with it. So unless you come up with something better than equity, or you change the law, your best bet is to just do something in compliance with the regular system. I'm all for changing the laws and making it easier, but the idea that you can just sort of change the definition, or cypherpunk around something, it doesn't really work, because at its fundamental nature, equity is a very, very good structure that you don't want to avoid. I mean, it's easy to avoid being a security. Just, a poem's not a security, but it doesn't mean I want to put $1 billion into a poem. There's certain things that just don't make sense, and equity makes a lot of sense. It's a good system. So I think that would probably improve a lot of DeFi projects if they looked at the world like that and say, what is it now, and what can we do? This idea that we're just not going to have securities is just crazy, because securities includes equities, and equities is awesome.
Certainly, a lot of development still to be done in this space, and I guess maybe it highlights, as we say, the nascent element of this space. People need to learn to work, and integrate it with the legacy system, rather than, I guess, some of those calls that still get made, although I'd say less and less often, for the sort of revolutionary change. That people want more of an evolutionary change than a revolutionary, and that still means integrating with the systems that work. So then, Bruce, looking ahead, here we are, mid 2021. There's a lot of optimism in the air, whether it be in terms of post, Corona opening up, the governments, sort of returning back to normal, economies seeming to be restarting and reboosting, and obviously in the crypto space, still a lot of excitement mixed with trepidation. But what are the sort of trends, the key points, the key ideas that you're looking out for? Sort of, let's say, until in the next 6 months.
Well, I'm watching, what's going to happen with the world. We haven't really paid the price for the lockdowns and the money printing. There was two massive things that happened. One, a huge chunk of the global economy was shut down, everything from factories to, restaurants and retail, and millions and millions of jobs were lost, and millions of businesses went out of business or faced serious losses. So that's significant, and we haven't really paid a price for that yet. The other thing that's significant is that the government has printed a lot of money. If you take, kind of all the money that they've in the United States already printed or announced that they're planning on printing, it comes to like 40% of the supply, over the, last year and next year or so. That period will be like almost half the supply of all the money that there is. And we haven't paid a price for that yet, unless you're in really paying attention, or you're in certain areas like lumber or other areas where you've seen the prices skyrocket. But, sort of the official word is acting like, everything is fine, and it's not fine. You can't have millions of people lose their job and then, make up fake money and not have a price to pay. Those jobs and people and businesses are the lifeblood of the economy. And if they're cut off, there's going to be a price to pay. So I'm watching for, when will that happen and what will happen? And it's important to think about this and be ready to adapt, because we don't know. Nobody alive today has seen anything like this. This is at the very least, a once in 100 years kind of fourth turning. At the very least, it might be more like a once in 400 year kind of, revolution, like we saw with the French and American revolutions. But at the very least, I think we can all agree that it's at least a fourth turning, the kind of thing you only see every century or so. Last time we saw it was just about exactly a century ago with World War I and creation of all these financial systems that we have, the IMF and the World Bank and the UN and everything kind of all came out of that. The borders that we see now generally came out of that time period. So I think we're looking at radical change ahead. Will it be a Great Depression? Will it be massive hyperinflation? Will something like the dollar collapse? Will the EU collapse? Something's going to happen. And it's not like, a quarter of down earnings and, airline flights go down and then they recover. That's not how it works. You can't take actions this significant and not have a much bigger price to pay. So watching that and keeping an eye on it and trying to adapt quickly once we figure out what that is, I think is something that everybody should do right now.
And in that sort of mindset, and if we're sort of seeing one of those major disruptions like that, what are your predictions for how cryptos as a whole, and maybe Bitcoin specifically, fare throughout that? Because obviously, so many say that Bitcoin will thrive in a crisis, that it was designed for it, it's the deflationary currency of choice. With so much enterprise interest involved in the crypto space of late, surely that money would be flowing elsewhere than what they would consider a risk-on asset, whether it truly is or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think the crypto narrative and the Bitcoin narrative specifically is very key to this because, I've joked before. I said, what if we were all wrong and we only by this weird one in a million black swan happenstance of the events of 2020, it made us right. These crazy events could be the catalyst that changed the way that money works. Eventually money has to switch, and maybe now's as good time as any. But the inflation is the thing. We should have pretty high inflation, 5-10% for a while. And I don't know how they're going to report it, or for a while they've been saying it's 2%. I mean, that's just absurd if you look at things like lumber. But eventually it's going to have to be reported accurately, and we're going to see it. And maybe people don't even care about the reporting; they care about their own reporting in reality. But inflation will be one thing that could drive the hyper Bitcoinization, or just a regular. If you go out and say Bitcoin's going to grow at 10% or something, based on inflation growing at 10% and Bitcoin keeping pace with it, even that is significant. So I think that there's never been a better time to buy Bitcoin because it's so much more likely to work, and it's so much less likely to fail. I mean, there's just so much interest in it now from institutions and people who are viewing this narrative as a hedge against inflation that I think it makes a lot of sense. And we've never been in a position like that before in Bitcoin. It was much more speculative before. And, you could have argued a lot more effectively 2 years ago. You could have argued, oh, no, there's no inflation. The dollar's fine. The Fed works. Everything is great. It's a lot harder to argue now. A lot of us have been arguing that for years, but I mean, now I think it's just like the curtain has been revealed now, and for everybody to see who's interested. I mean, it's clearly a big house of cards. The fiat government system is just nonsense, and I think anybody who pays attention should be able to see that.
It is amazing to see those, inflationary narratives re-entering the sort of public salience. It's that idea that people are actually aware that, things are going up and things are starting to look more expensive, something that hasn't happened in most of the developed world, we're talking a good generation now. It's been a while since there's been that sort of high level of inflationary pressure, enough that people can observe it day to day and see, hold on, this thing that cost me this yesterday cost me this, cost me this today. And it's, I think that awareness is interesting to see. But do you think that will bleed into the crypto space? Do you think people will then take that next leap of logic, those that weren't otherwise interested, and say, you know what, maybe Bitcoin fixes this?
I think some are already. I mean, if you look at some of the conversations and you go to, some of the places where people who haven't been into it are talking about it, they just know something's wrong, whether you're educated or not. Everybody kind of just knows. So you can talk with somebody who has a very low education level, who doesn't really know about economics or business or finance, and they just know something's messed up when they see their friends who are able to get paid to not work, and they see their company that can't hire people because the people are choosing to play Xbox instead, and they see the price of lumber go up, and they look at the leaders and they say, are these people that we can trust? I mean, do we know this? I mean, it doesn't take much. It just takes a little nudge. All they have to do is tune into a Bitcoiner and have somebody talk about these ideas of sound money and why how the Fed works and why it's broken. And the difference between scarcity and unlimited supply, and money printing for cronies. It doesn't take much. I mean, maybe 5 minutes you can say, oh yeah, and I've seen those conversations many times firsthand, where somebody just sort of knows, and it almost works better with somebody who doesn't have, years of preconceived notions, but it works with the really educated people as well. The people who are in business and lawyers and stuff who pay attention to CPI, and they know the history of the bond market and these kind of things. They pay attention too, and they know that this is unsustainable, and they know that 7 trillion in new spending in the United States, and I keep talking about the United States because that's where I am, but it's all over the world. Everywhere. These governments are just printing money and doling it out to cronies, and it's just not sensible and not sustainable. And Bitcoin may be a silly idea, maybe even a stupid idea, but it's less stupid than everything else. I mean, I often think that Bitcoin is kind of just like, man, really, this is the best we can do, but I think it is the best we can do. The alternatives just so absurd. Everybody's been circulating that photo of the G7 leaders, which there's 9 of them on the stage there. I mean, it just looks silly. It just looks ridiculous, and I think that as silly as Bitcoin is, I think if you look at that system and you say, wait a minute, I'm going to have Janet Yellen as my lead developer, and her and her cronies can just decide what the supply is, that that's even worse. That's a scam, and people are opting out of it. So I think it's exciting. A lot of people are learning this stuff. I think inflation is a catalyst for that, because it's bad economics and bad government systems of money have brought a lot of people into Bitcoin. That's why there's so many people from Argentina and Latin America and Greece and other places that had economic problems. Those were some of the first people to see Bitcoin, because there's nothing like unfortunately seeing your family's life savings or something tragic like that happen that educates people about money. A lot of people don't care, and they don't care about trillions and trillions in printing, but they're going to care when it starts hurting them, and that'll onboard a lot of people into sound money, I think.
Certainly, it'll be an interesting space to watch as people start to be more aware, more salient, and to see what that affects. As you say, countries that for so long have worked very well and now maybe are going through a difficult or change time. Bruce, so much more we could talk about here, but unfortunately we'll have to tie the conversation up here. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk over these major narrative lines, which I think are so critical in this space. And for all those watching, stick with Reimagine. We discuss this on so many different levels with so many different fantastic guests throughout the entirety of this conference. Bruce, I'll let you give the last word to the audience. Anything you'd like to say to sort of take us out, people need to be aware of, thinking about at the moment?
We're in a changing world, and it is changing fast. Don't let the change be against you. Learn all you can, and keep on keeping on, and hodl.
Sound advice. Bruce Fenton, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks a lot. Great to see you.